Deep in the shadowed forests of Clark County, Warren Leslie Forrest hunted his prey, leaving behind only whispers of horror. Today he rots in a prison cell. But are all of his victims really known? For years he begged for freedom, but after many failed attempts at parole, the world has given its verdict. Warren Leslie Forrest will almost certainly die behind bars. And yet, despite his monstrous crimes, his name remains a shadow in the history of serial murder. Why is that? How many remain undiscovered? How many more are waiting to be found? Warren Forrest turned these peaceful trails into his own personal hunting ground, leaving an indelible stain on the landscape. His name is whispered in the Pacific Northwest, a murderer that some have forgotten, but his victims never ever can. It began with disappearances. Young women, vibrant and full of life. One by one, they vanished without a trace in the Pacific Northwest of the 1970s. This was a region already tainted by infamous predators, the likes of Ted Bundy, who'd spent a lot of his early youth there. But there was another terrible monster lurking in the shadows of Clark County. His name was Warren Leslie. Forrest was a man who could move through life unnoticed. He was a married father and a veteran of the Vietnam War, and a seemingly unobtrusive employee of the Clark County Parks and Recreation Department. Part of his job was to maintain the wilderness. This is an irony that's so chilling it's almost incomprehensible. And that's because those very forests and lakes were his hunting ground. His crimes started to come to light on October the 2nd, 1974. The day before that, he had lured a 20-year-old lady into his van under the pretext of giving her a photo shoot. But this lady was not his first victim. She was only the first one who survived. Once he got her into a secluded place, his real intent became apparent. He beat her and he raped her multiple times. And then he shot her with darts from a high-powered air pistol he had in his possession. He then drove her to a desolate area near a place called Lacamas Lake, where he proceeded to stab her 6 times and strangle her. Believing she was dead, he stripped her completely naked and just discarded her body like a piece of trash into some bushes nearby. But she wasn't dead. Hours later, she came to, and although she was bleeding and terribly injured, she managed to stumble towards the nearby city, where she was picked up by some passers-by and taken to the local hospital, where she received medical treatment. Once she regained her strength, she was able to give police a detailed description of her assailant. That included the vehicle that she was taken into, which was a 1973 blue Ford van. The other significant fact is that while she was being transported to the secluded spot, she heard her assailant passing the time of day with people that appeared to be park employees, and this gave police their first clue. They were able to zero in on local park employees to see if any of them had an alibi for the time when she was assaulted. One person who did not have such an alibi was Warren Forrest. He was conveniently on sick leave that day. The police were sufficiently concerned to be able to get a search warrant for Warren Forrest's home. A search of his property turned up some jewellery and some clothing which belonged to the victim. After this, they showed the victim a photo of Warren Forrest, and that put it beyond all doubt. She didn't hesitate. It was him. Soon after this, another survivor came forward. This was a 15-year-old girl who'd months earlier been hitchhiking out of Ridgefield. Her name was Norma Countryman. She said that in July 1974 she'd been sitting by the side of the road smoking a cigarette when a man rolled up in a blue van and started chatting to her. She seriously thought about leaving the scene, but this man seemed quite engaging, and eventually she accepted a lift from him, which was a major mistake. The man had offered her a ride, but instead he took her to another deserted place on the slopes of Tukes Mountain. Here he tied her to 2 trees, and then he beat her and raped her repeatedly. He then left her, and that gave her the opportunity to make her own escape. She chewed through the gag and managed to free herself from the trees, and then she hid in the bush until morning, just to make sure that her attacker had truly gone. She then made her way out of the forest to find help. Despite the horrors inflicted on these women and the evidence they'd given, Warren Forrest was found legally insane, and instead of being imprisoned, he was placed in a mental institution, and this was at the Western State Hospital. After this came a discovery that changed everything. On July the 16th, 1976, 2 local Portland residents ventured into the area of Tukes Mountain. They were looking for wildflowers and mushrooms. During their search, they happened upon a brown shoe, and when they investigated further, they pulled out the brown shoe and found that, dreadfully, it was attached to a skeletal leg. What must these people have been thinking when they found this? Absolutely horrific. The remains were eventually found to belong to Krista K. Blake, a 20-year-old hiker who'd gone missing about 2 years prior to this date. At that time, witnesses stated that they saw her for the last time stepping into a blue Ford van. The similarities to Warren Forrest's crimes were undeniable. As investigators pieced together the evidence, things started to become undeniably clear. It was looking like Blake was not his first victim. 6 young women, all hitchhikers, had disappeared in Clark County between 1971 and 1974. Evidence was pointing towards Warren Leslie Forrest. Each of them had been seen getting into a van, and each of them had disappeared without a trace. When Blake's clothing was closely examined, it was found to have holes in it, very much like those made by darts from Forrest's air weapon. To begin with, Forrest's mother provided him with an alibi, saying that he'd been home with her on the night that Blake disappeared. But police pressed her, and when she was pressed, she faltered completely, and his alibi began to fall apart. Forrest was subsequently charged with the murder of Blake, and a trial was set in 1979. But to begin with, there was a mistrial because of a shocking evidential mistake. A second air pistol, very similar to the one that he'd used, was admitted into evidence, but this was nothing to do with his case. His defence team seized upon this. First of all, they asked for a mistrial, and secondly, they asked for the venue to be changed because they said in Clark County, Warren Forrest could not get a fair trial. And yet the truth could not be buried. His surviving victims took the stand, their voices unwavering despite the traumas, the terrible traumas that they had endured at his hands. One of these ladies was the then 15-year-old Norma Countryman, who would also later testify at one of his parole hearings, letting people know that this monster did not have the right to be released. Forrest pleaded guilty to the kidnapping and the attempted murder of the 20-year-old that I told you about earlier, but he denied any involvement whatsoever in the murder of Blake. And for his actions in the crimes that he admitted to, he blamed them on PTSD, coming from his time in Vietnam. He said that at the time of Blake's murder, he was on holiday with his wife and children, and initially his wife supported him in this, although she did later state that their marriage had been rocky for some time. She also stated that Forrest quite often suffered from blackouts. How convenient would that be? However, the jury saw through all of the lies. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but we still didn't know the full scope of his horrors. For years he sat in his cell, constantly denying any involvement in other murders. He went through hearing after hearing for parole, and as I mentioned earlier, one of his first victims, Norma Countryman, who'd been raped and beaten and left for dead by this man, was present at his parole hearing and gave evidence against him. But then in 2017, something changed. Absolutely astoundingly, he admitted to the murder of Christa Blake. He then went on to admit to a further 16 crimes, ranging from voyeurism to rape, but he vehemently denied any involvement of the murder of anyone else. And still no one believed him. And then in 2019, a breakthrough came when investigators were looking into some cold cases, and they were re-examining DNA evidence from some of these cases. As part of these investigations, some DNA that was recovered from his air gun that he'd used to shoot some of his victims was matched to a victim who at that time was known as just Jane Doe. She was unidentified. Her skeletal remains had been found in 1974, only 8 miles from where Christa Blake's body was found. And after a thorough forensic examination and DNA sequencing, finally Jane Doe had a name. Her name was Martha Morrison. Forrest was charged with her murder, and in 2023, some 50 years after Martha's death, justice was finally served. After another trial, he was handed down a further life sentence. So now this man had been convicted of 2 murders. But what about the other victims that he was suspected of harming? Police suspected that he was involved in the disappearance and murder of these other victims, the names of which I'm about to give you in respect of their memory. Jamie Rochelle Grissom, aged 16. Barbara Ann Derry, aged 18. Diane Gilchrist, aged 14. Gloria Nadine Knutson, aged 19. And Carol Valenzuela, aged 20. Because of these 2 murders that he was convicted of and the other people that went missing, who he was suspected of killing, Warren Leslie Forrest is synonymous with horrors in the Pacific Northwest. He was a man who walked completely unnoticed, a monster who walked completely unnoticed amongst his neighbours, his co-workers and indeed his family. He hid in plain sight and preyed on the vulnerable. When we look at Warren Forrest, this is a man who, with luck, will never, ever be released from prison, never to prey on anyone ever again. Our condolences go out to all of the family members involved. And with that thought, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And thank you for watching.